You know, if God has a particular plan for our life, and we remain in His will, we will be virtually indestructible until His plan for our life is fulfilled, which only makes sense. I mean, what could possibly prevent God's plans from happening? Now, very few in the Bible illustrated that truth better than David did. And few things in his life did that better than in his great conflict with Goliath. Now, what we're going to do this morning is begin a two-part series on this battle. This week, we're going to review the Bible's account of the battle in 1 Samuel 17, and next week, we're going to draw a number of applications from it. Now, I had hoped to do it all in 1 week, but it was just too much. So, this morning is not necessarily a class, a sermon, or anything. We're just going to review the battle. That's all. There's no necessary application, a few little ones, but that's all. But next week, we're going to dig out the applications from this battle for our lives today, in our battles with Satan and evil. In fact, as we look at this chapter this morning, I'm going to review this again a little bit later on, but I'm going to ask you to look carefully too for what lessons you see. Because next week, after I bring the message, I'm going to ask you for some lessons that you've seen. So this gives us 2 weeks to do this. It's a great chapter. There's a great story here. And there are definitely applications to be seen, as I trust you'll discover them. Let's begin in verse number 1. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shechoh, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shechoh and Azekah in Ephesdammim. Now the Philistines had been recently defeated by the Jews in a great war. But here they were back for another try at it. And the fact, notice, that they had gathered together at Shechoh, which belongeth to Judah, proves that they had invaded Israel and were confident that this time they would win. You know, we through the power of Jesus can defeat Satan too, but that doesn't mean he won't come back for another try at it. And that this time he won't make deeper inroads into our life than he ever did before. And Saul, verse 2, tells us, and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, about 6 miles west of Jerusalem, and set the battle in array, or in formation, to clash against the Philistines, surely supposing that as they had soundly defeated them before, they would soundly defeat them again. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side. Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head. And he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, which went from his knees to his ankles, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing a shield went before him. So here we see what gave the Philistines the confidence they would win. And believe me, just to behold Goliath was to see quite a sight. Let me put him into perspective here. The tallest man alive today is a little under 8.5 feet tall. And the tallest man in medical history was 8 feet 11 inches tall. Verse 4 tells us that Goliath's height was 6 cubits and a span. And how do we translate that? A cubit was 18 inches long, and a great cubit 21 inches long. A span was a half a cubit or 9 inches. So depending on which cubit is used here, he stood either 9 feet 9 inches tall or, and many believe this to be true, 11 feet 3 inches tall, which would be from this floor to way above the ceiling. Also, depending on his frame, he could have weighed somewhere, listen, between 600 to 1,000 pounds. Let me give you a very practical illustration of this man's size. Our head in length, follow me carefully, is approximately 1/6 of our total height. Which means if Goliath stood over 11 feet tall, the length of his head was almost 2 feet. And would have looked something like this. In other words, if he walked in here and sat down beside you, you would definitely feel his presence. Definitely feel his presence. Now as for his armor, verse 5 states that he was armed with a coat of mail, which were overlapping brass plates that covered his front and his back. And the weight of his coat was 5,000 shekels of brass, which means it was 157 to 200 pounds, depending on the shekel that was used here. Now, if this man was as ferocious as he was huge and powerful, he was a formidable enemy in anybody's book. Look at verse number 7. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spearhead alone weighed 600 shekels of iron, or from 17 to 24 pounds. Now, the Olympic record for throwing a 16-pound shot put is about 67 feet, and yet Goliath hurled a spear that weighed more than that, in even greater distance, very routinely in combat. So by any standard of comparison, this man was a killing machine. And so he could have both arms free to fight with. Notice that verse 7 concludes by saying that one bearing a shield went before him to protect him from arrows, stones, spears, and any blow from his enemy. All right, so who does a man this huge pick his fights with? Anybody he wants to, as we see in verse number 8. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me, perhaps down into the valley. If he be able to fight with me and kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we might fight together. So obviously his pride was as big as he was. But don't go thinking he was stupid, because he wasn't. What he had come to do, he accomplished to the letter, as we see in verse number 11. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Right, it was evident right from the start that this could not be a contest of might versus might, because Goliath could not be matched. It would have to be a contest between brawn and the flesh, of which Goliath had plenty, and faith in God, of which evidently Saul and his armies had little. I mean, look at them here. After one look at Goliath and hearing his challenge, they all became faithless, trembling cowards. Again, verse 11 tells us that when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, maybe there was a reason why they were so afraid, and why God gave them no courage. Because the good fortunes of killing this giant and removing the reproach he brought to God's people was going to fall to another. And we'll read about him in verse number 12. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem.